Hey, everybody, and welcome back to our study group studying Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy without any gaps. I'm Nadalian Plebs, and here with me today is Rogerio Marquez and Graham Pong. And today we'll be discussing episodes 9, 10, and 11 and covering Leucippus, yeah, I think that's right, Democritus, Anaxagoras, and Empedocles.
Thanks for having me, Nerdalium. For some context, we could show a bit of some visual aids to kickstart the conversation. And let's go, as usual, in improv, freestyle fashion, cutting these guys for size. Let's see how it goes. So as usual, we're still focusing on part of the Mediterranean, the more Hellenistic part, especially a bit of Italy as well, and Turkey on the sides. And today we will be talking about Leucippus, who we do not know exactly where he's from. Some sources say he's from Ilea, others say he's from Italy, so from Miletus rather. So since the sources are all over the place, as Peter Adams says, we don't know who this father of one of the major theories we will be discussing today hails from. But his peer or student, we aren't sure, hails from Abdera, that is to the north of the Aegean Sea. And which is a region called Thrace, known for people with fairer hair and fairer skin. Just to be completely different from the other cities of origin from our previous philosophers, mainly from the Ionian coast and also from Italy and Sicily. And so today our proposal is to focus on the episodes on Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy that cover Leucippus and Democritus, who are the atomists. And then we'll check also the very first major Athenian philosopher, Anaxagoras, and also a kind of another guy like Pythagoras, who mixed in concepts of mysticism and divinity, self claims of divinity, but still having worthwhile philosophical theories for us to ponder and digest. And so this is where we are at right now. Wonder if you guys want to comment on what was just presented.
No, I'm looking forward to learning a lot with you guys, getting to explore this material and getting some new insights from it. And I find it interesting to watch sort of how the spread of philosophy is happening from, the Ionian coast initially to where it's almost like spreading out across the Greek world right now. Very, very interesting exploration here. I'm enjoying it. Tagging.
Yeah, I think Peter Adamson says often when we think philosophy, we think Athens because that's where Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle did most of their philosophy, even though Aristotle was from Macedon. I think that's right. Anyway, so it's interesting to finally meet a philosopher from Athens, like all the others have been from other places. And it was also interesting to note that like the Italian philosophers, or the philosophers on the Italian side, seem to take a particularly kind of mystical approach to their thing there, about secret knowledge and divine teachers and all that kind of stuff. Where it seemed like the Ionians were a little bit more down to earth.
Maybe the Ionians were more concerned with enhancing their commerce capabilities, whether by shipbuilding, navigation, systems of writing, and keeping the count book well checked. and also weather prediction stuff. So and interpretation of or prediction of astronomical phenomena as well that could help with navigation. And while the Italian side, maybe these guys were a bit more relaxed in terms of mercantile pressures. It seems that Italy and Sicily were maybe more bountiful and self-sufficient in terms of crops and self-production. There's this notion during the Peloponnesian War when the Athenians invaded Sicily that they thought they would just have a nice highway through to invade after they made landfall. But that was not the case. The cities were really well established. Civilization was quite refined there. They were well defended, and so the Athenians, far from home, stood no chance. And so I hope it kind of gives an idea that I think there was more self-sufficiency and less pressure to trade as voraciously as in Ionia, which seems perhaps a little more drier lands if we go into the mainland, and so these Italian philosophers, Pythagoras used the divine trappings, perhaps himself or his followers, to kind of leverage his the appeal to him. Parmenides as well, in his poem with the trip to the abode of the goddess and getting philosophical information from her, and this Empedocles as well. So this is a really interesting pattern there with these guys from the Italian side. But we would also like to, I think, start with the atomists, which are more easily explainable in Peter Adamson's words, by contrast with the monists who we tackled yesterday.
Yeah, the Eleatics. Yeah, so Peter Adamson says it is quite a relief to finally hear a doctrine that sounds familiar and something like what we learn in school these days, for a change, rather than just plain craziness. He then goes on to explain that like, the thinking of like all of these people are quite foreign to us. In any case, even though there are elements that we can that seem closer to us. One of the things he explains is that for the atomists, they meant by atom something that is by definition not further divisible, which is slightly different to the way scientists use the word atom these days. So the atoms that modern physics talk about do have subparts and can be divided, and even those parts have parts. So he says, with disregard for etymology, scientists call them atoms. I think when they got their names, it was believed they couldn't be split, and then it was only found later that they could in fact be split.
Yeah, etymology of science has so many instances of misnamed stuff, because people misname stuff before they fully understand what they are naming, and then decades or centuries after, they discover properties that these things they had previously named have, like the atoms. That's the initial history of modern science kind of assumed, well, we found the supposed atoms that the ancient Greeks were talking about, and then they they started to make the electrons jump off, and then even later on they discovered how to perform atomic fission. So not even the nucleus, supposedly much more well contained and well walled off. It's just a matter of energy to overcome the energy barrier and separate them. And so, yeah, Peter Adamson really justifyingly rails against the traditions of science and then the history of science in the past, more or less for centuries, in which we end up with embarrassingly misnamed things, completely inconsistent in terms of etymology. Also, to make a parallel between these two atomisms, in all their familiarity, as you mentioned, Nerdalian, there are stark differences, because the ancient Greek atomists said that whatever is possible happens, whatever is possible is, and so their atoms have all kinds of possible shapes. I even tried to represent them here in the visual aid, including what Peter Adamson's words described as some having hooks and some having loops, and so to explain how different atoms interact and get clinged to each other. An early stab at describing molecular interactions, chemistry, and why things get wet, why other things are kind of water repellent. Probably these guys might have been inspired by these things that even through ancient times people can see. People were using dyes from shellfish to dye wool, and these dyes would stick even through many washes, making these dyes highly practicable, and prized, and highly priced. And so to contrast with the contemporary atomic theory, in which we described these corpuscles that are composed by three building blocks, protons and neutrons, in a very small nucleus. The analogy would be, if an atom were a stadium, the nucleus would be the size of a blueberry sitting in the middle of the stadium, and the rest of the atom is mostly empty space or void or ether or whatever you want to call it, with just a faint wispy presence of the electrons that are really hard to pinpoint where they are and at what speed they are moving about or manifesting their presence around the atom, and they go as far as the outer periphery of the stadium, with more than one shell in different types of atoms. And so in being similar and sharing the same name, atom, which is from ancient Greek as well, with so many words that are important in philosophy, there are stark differences between the two concepts, the ancient Greek and the contemporary scientific concept, that are worthwhile to flesh out, so we can also grasp and have an idea of how things have changed.
No, I was going to say that's some great observations. I'm a little more sympathetic to the past because I sort of see it as basically that the periodic table was the completion of the program that the ancient Greeks started, because their idea was it was the most indivisible unit of the reality that we can actually deal with on this human scale. And those are like, basically, that's the atoms of gold and everything. And that's what, the chemists and scientists, sussed out back in the 1800s. And what happened is the Greeks had no idea that there was something beneath that, other than some of the more abstract ones, but they couldn't even talk about it. And it's like, basically, we needed the Greeks to have their definition of atoms to push off of and experiment with and explore reality with, until we finally pushed that to its limits and found that, there's more to reality than this. So we need to build another level below that. And that's where the subatomic level and everything else started coming into play. And it's not so much that the Greeks were wrong, it's that, well, they were wrong, but they were almost like necessarily wrong for us to be able to leapfrog them to a greater insight and depth. And, again, I like to balance the both. We've gone a little farther, but we couldn't have done it without them having, laid down the groundwork to start with. Tagging on that.
Yeah, I also have appreciation for these early thinkers, and I was thinking maybe they did some work that can be built from without having to rework it, and especially like at the metaphysics level. I'm still not 100% sure what that means, but I think the kinds of arguments that the atomists were responding to about change not being possible because it being either nonsense to talk about non-being, or because infinity prevents change from happening. So that gives insights into, I guess, as Graham talked yesterday, like the way we frame theories about what's going on. And so like the way we, at a very abstract level, the way we talk about things. And so I think Peter Adamson explains that the atomists basically do two moves. So they take from Zeno this notion that if we assume that time or that space is infinitely divisible, we land in this paradox where motion is impossible. And so therefore it seems like a bad assumption that space is infinitely divisible. So there must be a smallest thing that cannot be divided, and hence they give a name to these smallest kinds of things that can't be divided, which I think that may still hold. Like, I'm not sure that we've really improved on that insight, at least at that abstract level. And then similarly for the argument that change can happen because it's nonsense to talk about non-being, making an observation that, well, plainly change does happen, and then turning that argument around. Like, since we can plainly see that change does happen, therefore it means that it must make sense to talk about non-being. Like, it's required, like we need conceptually this notion of non-being in order to make sense of change. So when you don't have the concept of non-being, you can't use it, you can't even define what change is or how change is possible. So that's an interesting way to make sense of non-being, which on the face of it may look a little tricky to make sense of. Like, how do you make sense of something that isn't? And maybe pointing out, like, well, we need this notion of isn't or wasn't or isn't yet in order to talk about change.
Yeah, to complement where you're, I think, aiming at, it is really strange that the atomists only addressed the apparent nonsense of subdividing matter infinitely, but they seemed more or less silent, or to skip the addressing also the divisibility of space infinitely as well. One thing that I really tried to address yesterday with this idea that probably space is pixelated, and the fundamental subdivisions of space and time are as physically manifest and physically real as the particles that traverse these pixels. And so it's really strange how they focused on the stuff that fills in the void, but didn't comment very much on the void as well. And they just assume, well, you say that you monists say that we cannot talk about non-being. Well, we're talking about non-being. Deal with it. And they didn't take opportunity to kind of flesh out more the kind of grid of the cosmos. But in what they did, it's really interesting that they planted the seeds of mostly explaining interactions between matter without invoking anything supernatural. So props to them for that, for not being so eager to fill in the gaps with supernatural and divine explanations, keeping the divine things for what Xenophanes likes to reserve to inspire moral virtue or moral character. So maybe Zeno unwittingly or unintentionally inspired Leucippus and then Democritus to come up with their atomic theory, which might have some traces of irony, because this completely backfired. Atomic theory is way more popular today in another form than monism, regardless of the truth of these theories. And to cover up what the atomists also mentioned, they have this two-sided argument, which is atomists claim Zeno's idea of being possible to divide matter and distance infinitely is nonsensical, and that there is some fundamental limit below which no further dividing is possible. But they focused, as we've mentioned, mainly on the atoms. And then the other one is, since we can plainly see that motion is possible, there must be such a thing as nothingness, the void. Basically, some kind of cosmic mechanism that allows for what we are supposedly observing.
No, that's what I was going to sit there and say is it's almost like people focus on the atoms more than they do the void. And what they were actually doing is much more embracing the modern sense of particle and field as one in the whole. Because you don't mention the atoms without the void here. And it's like the void is basically the field, and that's almost like the first time you have like this field and particle concept going on, which is very fundamental to today's physics and science as well, because you can't separate the two. So tagging.
Yeah, and they have some decent reasons for why you can't separate. I'm sure there's other reasons, and like one of these reasons is if you don't have the void, then, and even if you have atoms, then it would require that every atom be in contact with another atom, and so there would be no way to move, because it's like things would be too compact, like they'd be stuck, everything squished in immediate contact with each other. So it would make movement impossible. That was one of the arguments I think we discussed yesterday for why movement is impossible. I don't know if we actually explained that argument, but I think it's one of the arguments that Peter explains. And so, yeah, like if you have these particles, I guess, so that whole reason you need the particles and you need that they move, and then you get, well, then there must be void. Like you can't.
And again, it depends. It depends on the interpretation of how you kind of force things into your metaphysical worldview. If you want to conceptualize your metaphysical worldview as you are experiencing slices of time, and only the present is real, the past is left to memory and metaphysics, and the future as well, like future predictions, also into the realm of mind and attempts at prediction, while the present is concrete, is real. Then you will fall into this atomist notions that change is real based on this slice of time that we are experiencing. But if you use the monist worldview, you transition to an all-encompassing, in terms of time and space, worldview, and then things all of a sudden seem like they are completely established and fixed, and nothing moves at all. And these two worldviews are seemingly maybe what Parmenides kind of meant in his poem with the two ways. And I honestly don't think that one is absolutely clearly wrong and the other is more correct. They might have applicable uses for our lives, for humanity, in maybe in different contexts or different discussions. But there's no clear-cut way to say monism is wrong or right, and this kind of atomism with slices of time and motion is wrong or is right?
No, definitely. I think you're at a level where it's tough to say what is wrong or right. It's more like, again, they're like complementary concepts. What you're saying is very much echoing the whole Copenhagen interpretation with Bohr, where it's, it's particle or, what particle or wave, and, neither one of them is actually correct. It's that merging of the two. And in order to explore one of them, you kind of have to shove the other one away for the time being in order to look at the one. And that's just kind of how reality works with the self and other. It's like it inherently divides into two. And it all depends on how you divide it, and then you start to have different effects. And that's where, again, that's where all the philosophers are great. Is they're dividing things and then saying, wait, you divided that wrong. Let's divide it this way. And then, that's how we make our progress. And that's part of what's so exciting and interesting and fascinating for all the study of the evolution of philosophy and thought here. So, tagging.
Yeah, so that makes me think of a couple things. So, like different ways of dividing up the world. It reminds me of this notion of metaphysics being about like the framework through which we make sense of the world, and like different metaphysical schemes gives us different ways to divide up the world. And to make that a little bit more concrete, Peterson says that even though we may be like relieved that the atomists are defending common sense here against the Eleatics, they're actually also skeptical of the information we get through our senses, and so they also follow this reason-based approach to knowledge. And they made claims like, no, so what's really real are these indivisible atoms, and everything is composed of them. But so the fact that we think there are things like giraffes or slices of cheese or bones or whatever is a kind of illusion of the senses. Like in reality, there exist no giraffes. Like there is just the atoms that make up the giraffe are the only things that really exist. And kind of the thing I'm wondering is like that seems to be making a claim that dividing the world into things such that we can talk about giraffes is somehow inferior or less true than dividing the world into things called atoms. And kind of with Rogerio, that it's not always straightforward that one is correct and the other one is incorrect. I tend to think that for different purposes, different ways of dividing the world into different things can have different values. So we can different kinds of utilities. So from a pragmatic sense, sometimes it's useful to talk as if things like giraffes exist. If you're a wildlife preservist, or maybe examples others than giraffes would be easier. Let's say cheese. Like if you're a cheese maker and you buy and sell cheese, it would be not very practical to talk about atoms as if cheese doesn't exist. So to insist, no, cheese doesn't really exist, but like these kinds of atoms and those kinds of atoms, especially if you don't know the atomic makeup of it, even if you did, like even like for modern science, it's like talking about water as H2O and like the variations of H2O in that water for some purposes just doesn't make sense. You just call water water and like give me a bottle of water, and like asking how many moles of whatever molecules you want, it just isn't practical. And yeah, I think at the more abstract level also, I think some metaphysical systems can be seen as for some purposes more practical and for other purposes less practical, but not easy to see which one is correct absolutely and which one's incorrect absolutely. And given that sort of stance, I like to bring it back to the sort of value of studying the history of philosophy rather than just trying to like insist, no, tell me the philosophers who got philosophy right. I want to learn from them the correct metaphysics and get on with it. I don't waste my time with all the metaphysicians who got it wrong. Because of this thing, like for different purposes, different metaphysical systems can have more or less value. And getting comfortable switching in between ways of framing the world is very useful, even at a social level, because different people make sense in different ways. And so some people, like the only way you can really communicate with them is like at an interpersonal level is by making the right movie references. And if you're trying to speak abstract philosophical principles with them, communication just isn't going to happen. And then for other people, they're really physical and practical. So you have to speak in terms of mechanisms and make analogies with physical mechanisms. Otherwise, they don't understand. And if you're really strict about, no, there's one correct way to frame the world and everybody has to follow that, otherwise I won't talk to you because you're too dumb, you're going to miss out on lots of relationships with lots of people that you then can't have because you rigidly stick to one way of dividing the world into different kinds of things and different kinds of processes. And so just getting better at tolerating and incorporating a diversity of people in our lives, I think benefits from having some patience with people from different cultures at different times who thought of the world differently than us. Tagging on that one.
That's a lot to unpack. Before I go through what you just said, which is quite inspiring, I would also like to take the opportunity to joke about what Graham Pong mentioned with the perplexing, frustrating, no clear-cut correct interpretation existing for the experiences revealing the effects of what we call quantum physics. Particles and waves as one entity, they behave as a wave when the ghost of Parmenides is kind of willing it to be spread out through the cosmos, and then they collapse to point particles, kind of like it's the ghost of Democritus or Leucippus pulling the thing on to the other direction. And so we see the cosmos in that very concrete, very specific sense in these experiments of quantum physics, as if reacting to our observing the cosmos, which is extremely frustrating. There is, as we've mentioned with the comparison between the monists and the atomists, maybe we shouldn't kind of assume that one of these is the absolutely correct metaphysical system for every single purpose, not kind of a one-size-fits-all situation, but we can be more eclectic and seeing the value and potentials for both, even expanding this for other systems of or other models or doctrines or metaphysical systems. And as regards to what you were pointing out, Nerdal Pleb, I kind of missed my train of thought because I had to go back. So
That's all right. I think we can ask for Graham to maybe chime in.
I was going to say, what jumped out to me is it sounds like basically Heraclitus was reincarnated as Niels Bohr, because that whole Copenhagen interpretation sounds like something that Heraclitus would have come up with. Yeah, that was what jumped out to me there. And no, I 100% agree with Nadalian. It's the idea of it's like every person is going to parse the world a little differently because they're an individual. So every person is going to have something a little different than you to offer the world. And if you don't recognize that fact, then you're basically closing yourself off to parts of the world. And, again, it's your loss when you do that. So I think, that's sort of my way to say what Nadalian was trying to get across. Tagging.
One thing that I was trying to remember, I remember right now, is physics is kind of constrained with their rules, but metaphysics are much more versatile and much more bendable. The only thing that we need to take care of is to have no contradictions in our metaphysics. and atomism and monism seem pretty okay in terms of being self-consistent. And so what we need to do, since we are wielding this clay of metaphysics that is extremely plastic and versatile, we can make up whatever we want. And we can still, in the light of Parmenides, still say that since we can talk about it, it is part of being. But if we want some metaphysics that helps us to make dinner or catch dinner, or enhance our lives in some sense through physical technology, we better apply the appropriate metaphysical tools for the situation. While if we want to delve into more widespread, more expansive concepts of cosmology, maybe the monist system starts looking more appealing and being a better tool for the situation.
It's a question that just came to me about the nature of metaphysics. Like, would it make sense to call the generally accepted accounting principles and the accounting lingo that accountants and bookkeepers and auditors use a kind of metaphysical system?
No, that makes a lot of sense. That basically each different version of accounting would be a different metaphysical system, sort of analogy. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's also really important to clarify as much as possible what metaphysics means with concrete examples. This one is a really nice one. But even if we look at kind of like a family, we can say who the parents are and who the children are. But if we look at the parents, they are a couple, but the couple concept is not clearly expressed or manifested in real life. It is an invisible connection to our senses. We can only see the effects of the connection. And for the family overall as well, we can say that a bunch of people are a family, but only in virtue of the effect of those unseen, possibly quite strong connections. And so also this is part of what is metaphysics, when we are dealing with that which is above or is beyond physics.
Yeah, and so to maybe another example, just to have a bunch of examples to kind of see, would the terms and definitions and rules of a sport count as a kind of metaphysical system?
100%. I was also thinking as another example, various different political systems and governments and constitutions. It's almost like every constitution is a different metaphysics of law.
Yeah, no doubt. Even money, any form of currency, is a system of accounting, just like the example you've discussed earlier. Because it quite effectively, by virtue of money leaving the wallet or entering the wallet, it provides an accounting system for each individual. Same thing for bank accounts. And so as a metaphysical system engineered to provide a reliable system of accounting, we can say that it is a metaphysical system that is quite form fits function in terms of what it aims to do.
Yeah, maybe a last example from my side. Last night at least last night for me, a couple of hours ago, I did a stream about nonviolent communication. And Rosenberg has a system where messages are passed into observations, feelings, needs, and requests. And there's a distinction between receiving someone's message empathically and communicating a message honestly. And I think it's fair to say that's kind of a metaphysics of communication.
Yeah, nonviolent communication is a metaphysical system that people can study and incorporate into their own minds, which will have impacts, real world impacts, which is also one important aspect of metaphysics, metaphysical systems at their best, or sometimes worst. That they, by being, they, although they are immaterial, they influence the real world in a concrete sense. For instance, like nonviolent communication that might enhance communication between two individuals practicing it, even enhance relationships that are also other systems of metaphysics.
So we're going with metaphysics on top of metaphysics. And what I'm seeing is the difference between that and regular physics is that reproducing effects directly in the physical world, where you're interacting with the physical world and the replicatability. The other stuff is more ephemeral, is sort of the sense that I'm getting there. I don't know if is you guys tracking with that?
Yeah, we can contrast with another example, like a pool ball, and we have a player. The player picks up the stick or whatever it's called, and strikes the white ball. The white ball goes against the other balls. Everything from the action of the pool ball player is in the realm of physics, and we can clearly, with the current version of atomic theory and particle physics and classical physics, use these models to predict what's going on and what will go on. But in virtue of me referring to these models like classical physics, elastic objects colliding, like the pool balls that collide and more or less conserve their speed after the collision. The interpretation of what's going on in terms of the scientific theories are systems of metaphysics. But what we are seeing happen is our senses converting what's going on in the real world into sensory input, and then our brains are filtering out noise and presenting our minds with what supposedly is the signal. And so in this very limited sense of fashion of how we experience physics with our senses, we can have some grasp of physics. But we will always have our nervous system and senses intermediating.
No, that's a really good point and that's one that a lot of people don't realize, is what you're doing is really interacting with that model of reality in your head rather than the reality directly. You always have the senses and the motor skills in between as an inherent, basically limitation or narrowing of the processes back and forth between you and reality. Tagging on that.
Yeah, so back to maybe Democritus and Leucippus. So they did the same thing as what the Eleatics did, and claim to have discovered like somehow the true metaphysics, and saying, well, the ways ordinary people talk about the world is mistaken, and they have discovered the correct way to talk about the world, which is something I find a little distasteful and not super helpful to emulate.
Yeah, maybe they were kind of smug about it. This quote by Democritus is kind of by convention sweet, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, but really atoms and void. And so he's kind of, if regular people listen to him say this during those times, they were probably kind of prone to frustration, because he's describing things that really do make sense if we delve into it with our minds wholeheartedly. But what our senses give us shows nothing of this directly.
No, it's absolutely what I was thinking is the idea of the atomists and the elatics basically, you know, in some sort of philosopher gang war where they're just sort of throwing words at each other because they're just on two opposite sides. No, we have the right metaphysics. No, we do. And then just going at it. And it's again, it's like they're picking out, when you divide reality, it's like each of them are picking out one of them and saying, this is the only way to do it. And yeah, there are two ways. You picked one, you picked the other. You know, and again, I'm seeing Heraclitus just sitting there. Guys, just get along. Like,
Yeah. You want to read that quote?
Yeah, sure. I found it really interesting because it connects one aspect of each of these two opposing philosophical gangs, as we might put it. Peter Adamson said each atom in itself is similar to the Eleatic single being.
Yeah, in the sense that it was never created and it will never be destroyed, and it's a perfect thing that can't be divided into parts. Like it's a whole thing.
Yeah, what I'm picking up there is kind of a holofractal principle, where it's like you have the whole and the parts are reflected in each other.
That seems like a thing that avatar profile of a fractal would say.
I resemble that remark.
What's the name for people getting into logical problems because they mistake properties of wholes for properties of parts, or properties of parts for is it the mereological fallacy, something like that?
That sounds right.
That's a common
Sure.
thing. I'm not 100% sure if I remember that correctly, but I think there's a name for people making reasoning errors by mistaking parts for wholes, or properties of parts for properties of wholes, or properties of wholes for properties of parts, like in their reasoning, going back and forth implicitly in illegitimate ways.
Kind of like extrapolation problems, right?
Not exactly. It's more that the extrapolation I see is more of, I usually refer to more concrete than just those terms. I refer to what Nordalian's talking about as the forest and tree issue, where, you know, it's the forest is composed of the trees, it's the parts in the whole. What you're talking about is more of the map territory, where anytime you have a map, it's an inherent reduction of what the territory, and you can't sit there and confuse the two. Two related but different problems. Kagan.
So I'm not 100% sure what you meant by the extrapolation problem, but I kind of thought of induction fallacies, or problems of empirical induction and forecasting.
What I mean is you inherently lose information. Anytime you get a compression of the information, you're going to lose a lot of the details of the original information. And it's like somebody going with just their Google Maps and then driving off a bridge that, you know, is out of commission, but Google Maps thinks exists because they're blindly following Google's maps.
Well, our world is filled with many potential sensory inputs that our senses can pick up, but our senses are limited in themselves. Our eyes only pick up, for a concrete example, a very narrow sliver of electromagnetic radiation. And even in doing that, our eyes have the fovea and the peripheral vision. Only the fovea gets high definition imaging. The rest is kind of blurry. But our brain is, when it receives this sensory data, kind of acts like a painter and fill in gaps and whatnot. And there's also a bunch of, when the visual cortex is processing visual sensory data, it is trying to reject stuff that is non-essential to spare resources. And so this is in part the explanation of why certain optical illusions happen. It is a form of kind of gaming this system, or abusing the system that is by its very nature trying to optimize resources, but feeding it something that it will be tricked to discard. And then the two squares, for instance, that look like they have the different shading are exactly the same shade, because our compression algorithm in visual processing kind of discards absolute values and tries to make relative differences, and sometimes these relative differences don't match.
Yeah, while we're on the topic of brains and what they do in our minds and illusions and stuff, something that stood out to me was the atomist notion of the soul as being composed of a particular kind of atom, so smooth, round atoms. And it's just interesting to me the very different notions of what souls even are that we've seen so far, just from the couple of ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers we've looked at. So for Thales, it was the thing that caused movement, so that magnets and amber can also have souls. And for Pythagoras, it was a kind of harmony. And for these atomists, it's a kind of material that inheres in the body. And those are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they seem on the face of it to be quite different ways of conceiving what souls are. And yeah, like maybe a nice bridge into Anaxagoras, because for him, mind was this like really important thing to explain a really important part of his vision of the cosmos. So also, again, like a different from Thales and Pythagoras, and the atomists. Mind is a kind of infinite thing that causes other things to mix in different portions. It's itself not necessarily mixed in. I'm a little confused about exactly what the notion is. I'm trying to remember. But also using this kind of universal ingredient that has this almost godlike powers to explain why some things can think and other things can't. So there's a kind of, I guess it is a little similar to the atomists with their like stuff, but there's like some share of mind in humans and dogs, but not in rocks, and that's why humans and dogs can think and do mental stuff, and rocks can't. And I think Peter speculates that maybe the explanation for people who are more intelligent or less intelligent are people more intelligent have been endowed with more of this universal mind ingredient. And yeah, do you guys remember more of the system? I remember, I think for Anaxagoras, two really important problems are how mental things are possible at all. Also interested in describing the whole universe and having one cosmological system, and also really interested in the problem of how it's possible for things to mix together.
Yeah, Anaxagoras was a very dual philosopher. He focused on two different aspects, starkly different aspects of reality. One is the idea of that thing, that ineffable thing that is seemingly responsible for free will in human beings and other life. And he would say, mind is infinite and controls everything that lives. Peter Adamson even mentions that mind is present in different amounts in different beings, in larger amounts in human beings, lesser in dogs, and lesser still in insects. And the other focus of his attention was on describing, or at least addressing, the problem from the Eleatics that change was not possible in matter. And so in response to that, he basically says everything is in everything. And besides this, Peter Adamson went on to describe quite interestingly that Anaxagoras is really a thinker that benefited from the confluence or convergence of many other thinkers. I was inspired to make this visual by virtue of him being a very mixtape kind of philosopher, who combined lessons from Anaximenes, this idea that denser bodies collect in the middle of the cosmos while lighter ones collect on the outskirts, and so explains in a way why certain pieces of matter have more earth and others more fire and air, for instance. And then he also, for the concept of the mind, he probably drew from Xenophanes, with this idea, God just by thinking shakes all things. And so a kind of metaphysical entity that thinks probably permeates the universe and explains the logos, or why the universe is self-consistent. And also he addressed Parmenides' a problem with the denial of change by saying such is not required because everything is in everything.
No, no, absolutely. That's a great visual. It captures the idea that he's a syncretizer here. One of the things that I'm picking up is that he's really the first one of them that didn't, he's kind of moving from soul to mind. And he's kind of almost introducing a lot of our modern concept of mind as we know it now into the philosophy. And it's sort of like he's moving like from soul to mind, because one thing that always struck me is that the philosophers before now, they presuppose the concept of soul. That needs to be part of their system for some reason. And here he's sort of like moving that from soul to mind and combining the two. And like I said, I find that interesting where he's putting his little twist on it with the whole nous concept and all. So, tagging.
Yes, I'll read out the quote that Rogerio put on the screen. Possibly Anaxagoras' writings were a major formative factor in inspiring young Socrates into becoming a philosophical pioneer. And yeah, Peter explains how, I think in Plato's dialogue Phaedo, Socrates gives some biographical history before drinking his hemlock of him as a young man, and explaining how as a young man he read Anaxagoras. I was at first quite excited when Anaxagoras talked about this mind that controls everything, infinite, or all living beings, and was hoping that Anaxagoras would go on to explain how this almighty mind is the reason why everything is for the best. But then Anaxagoras mostly talks about how things are mixed in sort of chemistry and physics in ways that disappointed Socrates, and then forced him to develop his own line of thinking. And Plato credits that line of thinking with developing the theory of forms. So yeah, very influential, and also the one to move a lot of the action seemingly to Athens, where Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, for at least parts of his life, were stationed.
Yeah, and it's a really nice way to understand in part where Socrates comes from, which we will get to him. It's just a matter of time, but it gives us some context for a very mysterious figure in philosophy due to having left no writings. As you said, he probably wrote, according to his biographical account, Anaxagoras' theories, and was kind of frustrated by a lack of explanation of why everything in the world is for the best, when probably they were either still recovering from the Persian invasions, or starting or in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, which was not a pleasant time to live. So, and Socrates even fought in that war. But to go back to Anaxagoras, he's really he's really a nice break from only talking about the soul as an essential part of human beings, and also talking about a kind of a pantheistic concept of mind that kind of operates the cosmos and maintains the cosmos in order.
No, I was going to say Anaxagoras was sort of in between the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War. He basically died just after the war broke out, and it's kind of interesting that he was kind of pulling everything together in that one. And there's some thoughts that he may have fought actually on the Persian side of the Persian War, which I find kind of interesting. So tagging out on that.
Yeah, just a biographical note. Last time, Rogerio talked about being really impressed by people who were directly involved with politics. And I think Anaxagoras was quite close with Pericles, who was largely responsible for turning Athens into a center of commerce and political power and philosophy and arts and things. So did good things for Athens, at least, to build it up so that it could be a center of cultural activities. And not sure exactly what his role was, but it seemed like he had some decent role.
Probably an advisory role in virtue of his learned mind and whatnot. Perhaps even at a certain point a tutor to Pericles. Who knows? I'm speculating here, but it's possible.
I was going to say it's one of those where any sorts of those big revolutions in government usually often have like thinkers involved, and it's usually not just one man. It's usually, at least from what my reading, it's usually a group that ends up enacting it. And definitely, I could see him and Pericles and some of the other ones basically bringing the sense of that sense, and it's like a reaction to the Persian Wars to a certain extent, where Athens went one way and bringing the learning, and then Sparta went the other way with the more military approach, and then the two of them fought it out in the Peloponnesian War. Tagging.
There's also a really interesting concept that struck me with Anaxagoras, which is that there were in amongst this mixture of the matter that he describes what he calls seeds. These seeds were the beginnings of later distinctive substances, like, for example, air or water. Only mind stands outside this mixture. It must be over and above the things it is going to control. So it alone is, as he says, unmixed. This was words by Peter Adamson.
So this is also a kind of dualism that sees mind as somehow separate from physical reality, although interacting.
Mind is special, basically. It has its own rules. It doesn't mix with the rest of the non-thinking stuff. Mind is special.
Yeah. And just on the matter of mixing stuff, Peter Adamson makes a point that nowadays we don't think of that as a deep philosophical problem, usually, because we just think of things mixing as molecules juxtaposing between each other, which is maybe a simplified version of what really goes on. I think, Roger, you said some beautiful things with your biochemistry background. That, like, water is really a lot more complicated than just a bunch of chemicals next to each other. There's a lot of stuff going on. But so Anaxagoras specifically thought that when things mix, like, maybe one way to explain is like almost at an atomic level, each little bit of water mixes with each little bit of water, so that, like, as we would think, water molecules are different from, say, the wine, the molecules that make up wine. He would say, like, no, even at the molecular level, the wine mixes into the water. So that's kind of his theory of stuff and how stuff mixes, like down to the smallest level. everything has some measure of everything else in it, and so those relative quantities can change over time. But it's
So
in
maybe
its
maybe it gave us chemistry, biochemistry, and etc., but also gave us homeopathy.
yeah. Too harsh with homeopathy. I've lost friends over homeopathy.
You're not a true believer.
I'm not. Yeah.
I was going to say,
Otherwise, it was a good friendship. But I'm not a true believer, and she was a homeopath. So what are you gonna do?
yeah. Only thing I was going to add there is that, to me, what makes water so special is it's basically one of those few substances that actually gets larger when it transitions from a liquid to a solid state. Everything else tends to shrink.
Yeah. It's by virtue of the geometry of the water molecule. They are like little V letters, with the sticks of the V being more positive and the angle of the V being more negative. And so they arrange themselves. It also depends on the speed of the freezing process. But if they have time, they arrange themselves in a crystal-like structure. And the I think 5 water molecules, they arrange themselves by joining themselves head to a vertex, and they form a kind of like a hexagonal structure with emptiness within, where air molecules can dwell. And that explains why literally water ice molecules are flotation devices, literally, or flotation matters in relationship with liquid water.
No, absolutely. You're explaining so much why material science is still struggling to understand water.
Yeah, I'd say that material science, I think, is one of the disciplines that we have that has way more potential to flourish and unravel, even if the rest of the technology wouldn't progress anymore. There is so much that we can develop in terms of how we arrange and rearrange molecules.
Absolutely. Only one word needs to be said: metamaterials. Tagging.
Yeah. But still, we need to talk about the other guy, the Empedocles guy, before we close this thing.
Yeah, Mr.
And
Self-Important.
yeah, Mr. Self-Important, without a doubt. But before, I really would like to invite you guys to a little bit of history, a little fragment, maybe parchment or papyrus of history. I thought it really interesting how before starting to talk about the guy who claimed himself as a god, um, Peter Adamson describes a situation that is the rare occurrences in which people who study the history of ancient philosophy get all excited. Was in the 90s, in a library in France, in Strasbourg, someone found fragments of Empedocles writings, or attributed to Empedocles. And so few years ago, we got an updated version of his extant works, or his surviving works. And by talking about this episode, this situation, Peter Adamson describes that books in the time of these guys had nothing to do with the hard-covered or paper-bounded stack of papers that we nowadays call books. They really had these cylindrical artifacts that in those times there was no paper for them, only in China. It would arrive much later in the initial medieval period. in the Arab Golden Age, but in those times they only had papyrus, which was made from plants, especially grown in Egypt, or from parchment, which is made from animal skins. There is even a story of a rivalry between Pergamum and Egypt for their two competing libraries, which is at the same time funny but a sad story, because Egypt boycotted the library of Pergamum. They didn't want to export papyrus to them, which is a bad thing, because the library of Alexandria was very prone to burst into flames. And so they could at least let these guys from Pergamum do some backups, and so they did not do for them papyrus. The people from Pergamum had to resort to animal skins, and so parchment was developed, which is way more expensive than papyrus, but it holds longer. It's way more resistant. So this was a really interesting contextualization to the limitations of communicating the written word through large distances of time and space.
No,
Feel free to.
No, it's a fascinating competition there. I also remember reading about how Pergamon they were producing so much parchment. It was a lot of bio waste just from basically, just going through as many animals in order to produce the skins for the parchment. It was like a wholesale slaughterhouse at times there when they were at full capacity for production. And again, it was the transition to the parchment was definitely a huge step up for durability. Especially in more wet climates. Tagging.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on like all the industry and effort and expenses that went into like preserving the thoughts of some of these people, and also remembering the tragedy of how much has been lost to history through tragedies like the burning of the Library of Alexandria.
Or the sack of Constantinople later on. Or the two fires in Alexandria. One was when Julius Caesar invaded, and the other later was they blame Christians for it during the time of Hypatia, but it's unclear what really went down. But there were for sure tumultuous times that were burning these really expensive to copy manuscripts, because everything was copied by hand until the invention in the Western world of the printing press. I think it was in the 1600s or something like that, or 1700s. And so we've lost so much. I couldn't even pay tribute to what we have lost. Just the sheer frustration and disappointment of me as a young adult think that human civilization is taking care of itself and we are accumulating knowledge and wisdom responsibly. And the truth is so far from this.
No, I was just to build on that one. You left off a bunch of major ones. You got like Library of Ashurbanipal III that got trashed. You got when Genghis Khan sacked Babylon, how much that got destroyed when that happened. And again, in the Western world, the whole burning of the Glastonbury Abbey library. That one destroyed most of so much of the literature of Celtic history and stuff. It's just disaster after disaster after disaster. We've lost far more than we actually have. Tagging.
Yeah. Do you guys remember much of what Empedocles said? I was kind of a little bit distracted by sort of his persona, his personality, as calling himself a god and like offing himself by jumping, or supposedly being. The tale of him offing himself by jumping into a volcano, so that it would appear that he just disappeared into nothing as a god would. I kind of remember him talking about the things of the cosmos coming into being from a struggle of love and strife. And I remember like when things come into being, they come in by parts, and so there's like images of disembodied limbs and pieces of pieces of bodies coming into existence, kind of just strolling around without the rest of the body.
He seemed like Lovecraft before Lovecraft, in a sense. He had more than one quirk about him that can be said.
What struck me about him is he's the four elements aspect and the whole cosmological cycle, where it's like the different elements transform into each other. And what I kind of take when he means strife and love is more of abstractly attraction and repulsion. And that's sort of again, with those two concepts, it's tough to argue against it. But he builds it up in a different way that, again, made sense to the ancient Greek mind more than it does to our modern mind.
So we have, I think, analogous concepts in science these days of, instead of love, maybe something like complexity, and instead of strife, something like entropy. Does that sound?
I would think, or even like with electric one, positive and negative force. If you're looking at more of an electric sort of approach, yeah.
But the reason I went entropy and complexity is because he says in those two cycles, when love takes over, things kind of come together in harmonious order into like a perfect sphere eventually, and then strife takes things apart and separates them off into different kinds. So there's a coming, I guess you're right, like a coming together and a separating, but then the separating is also kind of coming together of different kinds coagulating together by themselves. So yeah, it's a little tricky to translate those notions.
Or nowadays we could call upon the concepts of dark matter and dark energy.
And the other ones that jumped out at me was in the West, more of Anaximander with his apeiron, with things coming out of and joining back in with the boundless, or the Tao in the East. Similar sorts of concepts. Tagging.
It's also worthwhile to say, to give some context to the story about his death, hurling himself into Mount Etna, active volcano. We also need to take this account with a grain of salt, because the source is Diogenes Laertius, his compilation of the lives of the eminent philosophers. And his kind of musings of kind of gossip on the lives of these philosophers. In a few of them, he has been kind of exposed as kind of filling the gaps with amusing stories. Or his methods of compilation also weren't watertight, and so he probably incorporated things for impact and style instead of for accuracy, historical accuracy. And to go back to Empedocles, he either hurled himself into a volcano or went to the Peloponnese and no one saw him again. These are the possibilities. Also, it's interesting, as we've said previously, that he may have been, in terms of how he worked his public image, maybe he drew from Pythagoras in painting himself in divine tones. Perhaps people were really impressed with the divine around him, and for people to take philosophers more seriously, some of them resorted to these cheap tricks. But at the same time, there are accounts that he was also a healer, or at least knowledgeable enough to practice some medicine, because supposedly he performed resuscitation on a woman.
Yeah, kind of have more patience with narcissists who also serve their communities by practicing things like medicine, but also know about narcissists, that they'll take credit for serving communities in ways that they don't. So if you take credit for being a god, you might as well take credit for healing people miraculously. Why not making stuff up to make yourself look good?
Yeah. It's difficult to disentangle what is PR work here, to kind of mythically paint himself, or having his disciples also collaborating in terms of this kind of PR scheme, to what is really historically accurate. But well, at least we have these two principles, love and strife, that also remind me of I think it's Schopenhauer many years later in Germany, who also is big on describing the strife component of life. Not so sure if he also delves into the its opposite. Yeah, and also there's this discussion on the metaphysics of Empedocles, that they say that there is a waxing and waning between the conflict of love and strife, and sometimes there are cycles in which love is dominant and other cycles in which strife is dominant, and only in the in between of these extremes can we supposedly exist. And so I found it amusing how people, maybe even today, are still discussing whether we are coming from love to strife or vice versa.
It's more like we're the interaction between love and strife. I think that's basically what Empedocles would say, and probably what these people are missing. Again,
There is a like a way to read lots of narratives of political ideologues, or of religious teachers, or of just anyone who has much of anything to say about history. Historians, I guess, have a lot to say about history. Some tell a story of progress. So there was a state of so in Empedocles' term, a state of relative strife, and we're sort of moving towards a better state together, towards a more state of love. And then some people are really nostalgic for the past, and they see a deterioration from a golden age. So we've lost the wisdom of the ancients, and things are falling apart, and they're just progressively getting worse and worse. So imagining a past of love and moving towards strife. And then there are people who actually agree with Empedocles that like everything is just cycles that come again and again. I think in Western tradition, Nietzsche had this cyclical theory of history. But I think it's more common among Indian traditions to think of time as a cyclical kind of thing than it is in the West.
But there's also Hegel's dialectic, with the thesis being addressed by the antithesis, and then in the next cycle, the resulting synthesis becomes the new thesis, the new status quo, and so on and so forth. And whatever is the thesis of an age is kind of like the spirit of the age, or the zeitgeist. And so I found it really interesting how this idea from Empedocles is kind of similar to this concept by Hegel.
no, I can definitely see that. I hadn't looked at it in the Hegelian dialectic there, but no, I definitely see the observation. Taken.
To complement this, go ahead.
Just because on the Hegelian one, I think that's in the kind of analysis I was doing, I think that would count as a kind of progressive history. As he, I think, sees spirit growing through that dialectic. So the spirit that drives history as becoming more aware and more self-aware, and like sort of also quite hubristically claims that in his system, the spirit of history has finally become self-aware. He's like, his work is the result of spirit becoming self-aware, and so in some sense a capstone to all of history. So he sees spirit being less evolved and evolving into supreme state that is his philosophy, which is something that again is not super attractive to me about a thinker to make such
regarding Empedocles, it's also worthwhile to mention his description of the four elements: fire, water, earth, and air, which is, to be fair, to be frank, not entirely new, but new for the Western world. There are arguably these descriptions of the four elements in ancient Hindu Vedic texts. But Peter Adamson described here for Empedocles that even people who have never really encountered ancient Greek philosophy know about these four elements. You might hear people talking about them when discussing astrology, for instance. Empedocles was the first person to establish these as the basic ingredients of the world, which I kind of contested prior. Mind you, he doesn't always just call them air, earth, fire, and water. That would be too straightforward for his style. Instead, he uses the names of gods to refer to them. For instance, in one fragment, water is the goddess Nestis, and fire the god Hephaestus. So he's bringing back the gods are in all things kind of thing.
Yeah. Interesting. I didn't note that Peterson mentioned any arguments that he made. So don't know if he made any arguments with Peterson's. One of his things that he says puts the philosophers apart from, say, the poets or the priests or whatever, is that they make their claims based on arguments. And Empedocles doesn't seem, at least the way Peterson presents it, doesn't seem to be arguing much.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to be arguing.
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say that's also related to him being the last poet. He was the last one to put his last philosopher to put any of his writings in verse. So that could be, he's like that last transition. Again, not surprising that he has that God aspect. You have these like the last gasp of the gods amongst the philosophers from that sense. Pagan.
I was going to say that he is not arguing like philosophers who use reason. Do. This guy kind of returns. But what I'm going to say is he didn't argue per se. He was kind of like declaiming, like Hesiod would declaim. He basically, and Parmenides as well. He puts his philosophical arguments in the trappings of poetry and myth, which were the expected success kind of texts in that day and age. And so it might be, for one, a way of bamboozling people, of writing things in this style, or it could be an effort to adapt wisdom to what the people can digest in that day and age. Just as we mentioned in the beginning of our session, that there are some people that if we don't talk to them with movie references, they'll just tune out and lose interest. Or other people, they only converse in terms of memes. So maybe there could be some communication effort here of adaptation to the audience.
Yeah, that's possible.
There's also another aspect that I would like to bring forth, which is the four elements can be interpreted as how they are interpreted in astrology, fire, earth, air, and water. But we could also kind of see or speculate whether the ancient Hindu philosophers and guys like Empedocles weren't actually trying to describe states of matter, because earth could be kind of equated to what is solid, water or what is fluid could be equated to liquid, air is equated to gas, and fire is equated to plasma.
Yep.
Just like Heraclitus would talk about fire as being the currency of the cosmos, and it's quite clear that he probably is talking about energy.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. That was a connection that I made a while back, is that they're actually talking about the states of matter and the transitions from solid, liquid, water, fire. And then the correspondence to aether would be basically the quantum vacuum.
Yeah.
Tagging on that.
Or the void.
Same difference.
That's interesting interpretation. I don't have much more to add about that, guys. Should we call it a day?
Yeah, sounds reasonable.
No, it sounds like we've done our cycle with Empedocles here.
Yeah. The only thing more we would be to talk about his apparently potentially disturbing text describing how the eye is constituted and whatnot, made by Aphrodite, in his very Lovecraftian style. Probably it worked with the young impressionable young adults, his disciples and whatnot, and so quite a funny character and an intriguing character with all these quirks that he had in his life.
Yeah, so I hadn't actually thought of the angle of going for like communication impact, but so he believed in reincarnation and argued that people shouldn't eat meat because they may end up eating family members or past. And he describes the scenario in gruesome detail. That does make it impactful. And if you really want people to stop eating meat, like probably more impactful than just saying like, well, there's this risk, and keeping it all abstract and going into gory graphical images would make that more. And so maybe, the trappings were less hubris and narcissism and more just, this is what the people need to pay attention. And
he was a showman.
Yeah, he seemed like a good communicator in terms of, if he really wanted to raise awareness of people to eat less meat and have a more healthy lifestyle, he was employing some techniques that people use nowadays in advertising, sparingly, with moderation, of course, but he was kind of trying to call attention to shake people out of their kind of slumber, wake people up, and then, because they are kind of impressed by this kind of vivid description, like he describes a father who raised up his own son in prayer before brutally slaying the child, heedless of his screams. But he was talking about the child already being reincarnated as an animal of livestock, and so the infant mortality was very high in these times, and so it's really possible that a child would die early, be reincarnated in this metaphysical concept as an animal of livestock, and then he has kind of like these arguments that people can be shocked and impressed. And I think shock and impression might constitute a form of learning in some aspects, that dry exposition without any either humor or vivid, disturbing metaphors, whatnot, would be just a dry exposition would be kind of meaningless to the audience. While if you make things evocative, the audience might learn something at a more fundamental level that might change life actions and life habits.
Yeah, I really appreciate the effort Peter puts into making his telling of the history a little humorous. He tries really hard to make giraffe jokes. It's good.
Yeah.
He's channeling his inner Empedocles.
Yeah.
He hasn't called himself a god yet, at least.
But his body of work is almost godly.
Hey, he still has time to throw himself into volcano. There's time left.
Yeah, and he has many more volcanoes to choose from. Hawaiian volcanoes, Italian volcanoes.
Also,
etc.
he could throw himself in many more ways. He could catapult himself in ways that Empedocles wouldn't have been able to. He could jump out of a helicopter. He could do one of those flying suits or whatever.
Yeah.
Make it theatrical.
I was going to say, there are plenty of people who've gone into the Hawaiian volcano and come out alive, so maybe they're all gods. Yeah.
Anyway, guys, thank you for joining. Like I said, I appreciate you guys going through this material with me. It's like really interesting material for me, and I appreciate having company to help go through it.
Same here. It's a great journey. Enjoying it.
Likewise, the journey is full of bounties and treasures.
Yeah, and thank you to the audience for joining. We'll see you when you see you. Next weekend is Easter weekend, so
yeah, we'll see. We'll announce stuff.
Let you know. Anyway, bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.